Have you ever wondered from which country you are listening tonight? And what time is it where you are, as you gently prepare to rest? Before we step into the quiet lanes of medieval villages, I'd love to invite you to take a slow breath, settle into comfort, and if you enjoy these calming history stories, please consider liking this video, subscribing, and turning on the notification bell. It helps this channel continue sharing soothing stories of the past, made just for your relaxation. And later, I would be delighted if you could share in the comments where you are listening from, and what time it is now in your corner of the world. Close your eyes, and let us gently drift back many centuries into a world so distant, yet strangely familiar. Imagine wide fields touched by a cool breeze, narrow dirt paths lined with simple homes, and the slow rhythm of footsteps as villagers move about their daily tasks. The medieval world was not filled with bright lights or bustling machines, but instead with quiet labor, steady endurance, and the endless turning of the seasons. Tonight, we will step softly into that world, exploring the lives of peasants whose daily efforts shaped history, though their names were often left unrecorded. In this journey, we will not rush. Instead, we will walk slowly, noticing the stillness of early mornings in the countryside and the calm sound of tools working against the earth. These peasants lived ordinary lives, yet their ordinary days were the foundation upon which kingdoms were built and maintained. As you listen, let the calm repetition of their tasks carry you deeper into rest. Just as the quiet rhythm of history continues through time, life in medieval villages was centered around simplicity. Homes were made with timber, clay, and straw, standing close together in clusters that gave a sense of safety and community. There were no tall towers of glass, no rumble of distant traffic, only the quiet of animals, the creak of wooden carts, and the steady voices of people who depended upon one another. The pace was unhurried, set not by clocks or alarms, but by the rising and setting of the sun. As the sun rose, peasants began their day. The light itself was not their provider, for only Allah grants true benefit. But it was through His will that the warmth and glow of daylight allowed them to see their work clearly. A peasant's routine was simple: tend to the soil, feed the animals, repair tools, and ensure the household had what it needed to survive. It was a cycle repeated endlessly, yet each season brought new challenges and small victories. Children were part of this cycle too, learning from their parents by joining them in the fields or caring for younger siblings at home. There were no modern schools as we know them today, yet learning still happened every day. Skills were passed down quietly through example and repetition, ensuring that survival knowledge lived on through generations. The bond of family was both necessary and cherished, shaping the structure of daily life in ways that remain recognizable even today. The village was not only a place to live, but also a place of belonging. Neighbors depended on one another for survival, sharing tools, lending animals, or helping with harvests. Cooperation was essential, for no single peasant household could easily endure the hardships of weather, illness, or poor harvests alone. In this sense, community was more than companionship, was a form of protection, quietly woven into the daily fabric of life. Peasants often had little wealth, but their lives were full of rhythm and purpose. They did not measure their worth by coins or treasures, but by their ability to work the land, to provide food, and to raise families in humble strength. Though their world was small, it was steady, and in its steadiness there was a kind of peace. Tonight, as you listen, perhaps that sense of calm repetition can help you drift into a restful state of mind. Their clothing was simple, made from coarse wool or linen. Colors were often muted, drawn from natural dyes, with garments designed more for function than display. Clothes kept them warm, shielded them from the elements, and reminded them of their role in the land they worked. In these modest garments, peasants moved quietly through their days, rarely noticed in the grander stories of kings and nobles, but always present, always essential. To imagine the medieval countryside at dusk is to imagine quietness itself. The fields fell silent, the animals returned to their shelters, and faint voices carried through the evening air as families gathered in their small homes. Fires flickered softly, providing light and warmth, not by their own power, but because Allah permitted fire to give its heat. In those evenings, peasants rested from their labor, just as you too are invited to rest now, letting go of today's worries. At the heart of peasant life was the land itself. Every handful of soil was worked with patience, season after season, as if it carried the memory of countless generations before. The land provided grain, vegetables, and pasture for animals, but only through effort, endurance, and the will of Allah could it sustain them. A failed harvest meant hardship, while a good harvest meant survival through the long winters. This delicate balance kept peasants deeply connected to the rhythms of the earth. Hunger was a shadow that peasants often knew well. Winters were particularly harsh, when food grew scarce and families survived on whatever had been stored. Meals were plain, thick bread, pottage made from beans and roots, and sometimes a little cheese or eggs. On rare occasions, perhaps during harvest or village gatherings, more variety appeared on the table. But most of the time, food was less about pleasure and more about sustenance, keeping life moving one day at a time. Despite the hardships, there was resilience in their way of life. Peasants accepted that challenges were part of existence, and they found strength in persistence. Each dawn meant another chance to continue, to mend what was broken, and to prepare for what lay ahead. In this slow endurance, they built not only survival, but also a sense of quiet dignity. Their world may have been small, but within it, they carried a lasting strength. The evenings often carried a softer rhythm. Families gathered close in their small homes, the air heavy with the scent of smoke and straw. Conversations were gentle, sometimes about the day's labor, sometimes about nothing at all. Stories passed quietly from one voice to another, not recorded in books, but remembered in hearts. These quiet nights offered a brief comfort, a moment to breathe after long hours of work. When illness struck, life became more uncertain. Without the knowledge of modern medicine, peasants relied on herbs, rest, and hope. Healing was seen as coming from Allah alone, while plants and remedies were merely means through which He allowed recovery. Illness was feared, yet it also reminded families of their dependence on one another. In such times, neighbors stepped forward, offering care, food, or comfort as best they could. The soundscape of the medieval village was soft and repetitive. The lowing of cattle, the clucking of hens, the steady thud of a hammer on woodle blended into the gentle hum of life. There was no rush of engines or buzzing of wires, only the natural tones of daily tasks. For the peasants, these sounds were ordinary, but for us, they paint a picture of a slower, calmer rhythm of living. Perhaps, as you listen, you too can feel that calm guiding you into rest. Seasons marked time more than dates. Spring signaled planting, summer brought long labor, autumn meant harvest, and winter required endurance. Each turn of the year was a reminder that life was fragile yet steady, changing yet familiar. The cycle gave peasants a framework, a rhythm to live by. And as one year slipped into the next, their stories carried forward, quiet but enduring. Though forgotten in the grand tales of kings and castles, peasants lived lives of deep significance. Without their labor, no kingdom could stand, no noble feast could be served, no city could grow. They were the unseen hands that sustained societies, their quiet efforts forming the hidden foundation of history. Tonight, as we rest with their story, we honor the persistence of ordinary people who shaped the world in silence. And now, as we close this gentle introduction, allow yourself to breathe deeply and rest. Let the stillness of medieval fields, the calm rhythm of village life, and the quiet voices of families long past carry you toward sleep. Before you drift fully, perhaps take a moment to reflect on your own day. How was your day? Share a line if you like in the comments below, so that our quiet community may connect gently across time and place. A medieval village was not grand or crowded like the cities we imagine today. Instead, it was small, quiet, and made up of a handful of homes gathered together, usually surrounded by fields and forests. These clusters of life were humble, but they were also strong, providing both shelter and a sense of belonging to those who lived there. The village was the center of daily existence, the frame through which peasants viewed their entire world. The homes in these villages were modest, built from materials that could be gathered nearby. Wood, clay, and straw were the most common, shaped into walls and roofs that provided warmth and cover. The designs were simple, often with just 1 or 2 rooms, but every space had a purpose. Within these walls, families found comfort after long days of labor, proof that even the simplest structures could carry deep importance. At the heart of many villages was an open space, often used for gatherings or the keeping of animals. This central area tied the homes together, reminding everyone that survival was not an individual task but a shared effort. Around this common ground, narrow paths wound between cottages, leading to fields, pastures, and sometimes to streams that provided fresh water. The village layout reflected practicality, designed to meet the needs of its people. Animals played an important role in the village setting. Chickens wandered between cottages, cows and sheep grazed nearby, and dogs stood as quiet guardians of the homestead. These animals were more than companions. They were essential for food, clothing, and work. Yet even with their usefulness, peasants understood that these creatures provided benefit only by the permission of Allah, who created them and allowed their service to human life. The village was alive with gentle sounds. The lowing of cattle, the crowing of roosters, the clatter of wooden wheels on dirt, and the quiet voices of neighbors filled the air. There was no rush of engines or electric hum, only the simple music of ordinary life. For those who lived there, these sounds were the background of existence, as natural as the turning of the seasons. Daily movement through the village was slow but constant. People carried baskets of grain, bundles of wood, or tools for the day's work. Children played along the paths, sometimes helping with small chores, sometimes chasing each other in brief moments of joy. Elders walked more slowly, offering advice and stories that helped guide the younger ones. Every step in the village contributed to the rhythm of shared living. The boundaries of the village were often marked by hedges, fences, or natural features like streams and forests. Beyond these edges lay uncertainty, wild animals, thieves, or distant lands that few peasants would ever see. For most, the village was not just home but the whole universe, containing everything familiar and safe. Rarely did a person travel far, for all that was needed to survive could be found within or just beyond the village. Workshops and small outbuildings surrounded many cottages. These were places for storing tools, drying crops, or repairing items needed for daily life. A blacksmith's hut might stand at the edge of the village, where iron was shaped into nails, plows, or hinges. Though modest, these workshops carried the heartbeat of the village, turning raw materials into items that kept survival possible. The village paths themselves told stories, worn down by countless footsteps, cartwheels, and hooves. They connected homes, fields, and forests in lines of memory. Every groove in the soil held echoes of journeys made for planting, harvesting, or simply visiting a neighbor. These paths were not only practical, they were symbols of connection, linking lives together across seasons and generations. Evenings in the village brought a different atmosphere. As the sun lowered, animals were led back to shelters, tools were set aside, and smoke rose from chimneys. Families gathered inside their cottages, where the glow of firelight softened the walls and brought warmth against the night air. Outside, the village grew quiet, with only faint voices or the occasional bark of a dog breaking the silence. In this stillness, the village rested, ready for another day to come. The seasons shaped not only the fields, but also the look and feel of the village itself. In spring, the paths were muddy from rain, yet alive with green shoots and blossoms. In summer, the cottages stood against long days of bright light, while the air buzzed with insects and the smell of freshly cut grass. Autumn brought the golden colors of harvest, the sight of grains stacked high, and the preparation for colder months. Winter covered the village in quiet snow or frost, muting every sound into stillness. Each household in the village carried its own responsibilities. Some specialized in keeping animals, while others worked small plots of land. A few might focus on skills like weaving, carpentry, or brewing, while no single family had all they needed. Together, the village formed a system of shared survival. In this web of interdependence, trust was not a choice. It was essential. The spiritual rhythm of village life added another layer to the setting. While peasants worked hard in the fields, they also marked time through days of rest, reflection, or communal gathering. These moments reminded them that life was not only labor, but also community and memory. The village square, the paths, the homes, all of it, carried both the weight of work and the gentleness of shared human experience. In these moments, the village felt less like a place and more like a living bond. Children, though young, were part of this living system. They carried water, fetched wood, and tended to smaller animals, learning responsibility from the very start. Play was not absent, but even play often mirrored the adult world, mimicking the tilling of fields or the care of livestock. Through these games, skills were passed along without words, ensuring that the next generation was prepared to carry the village forward. Childhood was brief, but it was woven into the rhythm of village life. Festivals and gatherings were rare but important parts of the village year. These events often centered on the harvest or the turning of the seasons, when work paused briefly and neighbors shared food, music, or dance. For a short time, the heaviness of survival gave way to laughter and togetherness. These gatherings strengthened bonds, reminding everyone that they were part of something larger than themselves. Even in simplicity, there was joy to be found. The architecture of the village may seem plain to us today, yet it carried beauty in its own way. The lines of cottages leaning gently, the thatched roofs bending under weather, the fences made of woven branches, all told the story of human hands shaping their surroundings. Nothing was wasted, everything had purpose, and through this modest design, the village remained both fragile and enduring. It was not meant to impress, but to function, and in that function, there was quiet grace. At night, the village revealed another kind of life. Without lamps or electricity, the stars shone with piercing clarity overhead, filling the sky with countless lights. Families huddled indoors, listening to the crackle of the fire, while outside the air grew still and heavy with silence. The faint sounds of an owl or the distant rustle of trees reminded them of the larger world beyond their walls. In these hours, the village seemed both small and infinite, cradled beneath the vast heavens. Illness, storms, and poor harvests sometimes tested the strength of these communities. Yet time and again, villagers endured, drawing on the resilience of their people and the will of Allah, who alone controls life and sustenance. Each hardship left its mark, but it also deepened the bonds among neighbors. The village setting was not free from challenge, but it was built to weather storms with quiet determination. Its strength was not in wealth, but in unity. In remembering these villages today, we glimpse the roots of human connection. Their paths and homes may no longer stand, but the rhythm of their lives continues to echo through history. The peasants of these villages shaped not only their own survival, but also the course of entire nations, though their names are forgotten. In their quiet strength, we find lessons about patience, endurance, and the deep value of community. And so, we leave behind the simple yet powerful setting of the medieval village. As you rest tonight, allow the image of that quiet community to settle gently in your mind, carrying you toward calm sleep. If you wish to walk further with us through history, I invite you softly to subscribe, so you may not miss the next story. In our upcoming journey, we will explore a darker and more challenging time. How did people cope with the plague in the Middle Ages? Until then, may peace and rest be with you. The life of a medieval peasant was measured not by clocks, but by the slow turning of the seasons. Spring, summer, autumn, and winter shaped every choice, every task, and every hope. This rhythm gave structure to their days, creating a cycle that repeated endlessly, steady and unbroken. Tonight, let us walk slowly through each season, as though we too are peasants, feeling the passing of time through the land beneath our feet. Spring marked the beginning of renewal. The soil, hardened by winter frost, softened under warmer rains. Peasants moved quickly to prepare their fields, guided by the urgency of planting seeds before the ground warmed too much. It was a season of hope, where the effort of today carried the promise of food for tomorrow. In every sprout that emerged, there was relief and gratitude for the chance to begin again. The work of spring was demanding. Men ploughed with wooden tools, often helped by oxen, while women and children followed with baskets of seeds. The ground smelled of fresh earth, and the air echoed with the creak of carts and the steady rhythm of labor. It was not glamorous, but it was essential. For without spring planting, there would be no harvest to sustain life through winter. Summer brought long days of heat and unending work. The fields demanded care, weeds pulled by hand, crops watered, and animals tended. The sun lingered in the sky, stretching time itself, and peasants labored until their bodies ached. Yet the season also brought abundance, ripening fruits, grazing livestock, and the fullness of green landscapes. Summer was exhausting, but it was also reassuring in its productivity. In summer evenings, the village rested in a different light. The air was warm, the sounds of insects filled the night, and families gathered outside their cottages to enjoy brief moments of peace. The glow of fire in the distance, the chatter of neighbors, and the calm of the stars created a rare softness in their lives. These small pauses gave balance, a reminder that even in hard labor, moments of rest were allowed. Autumn was the most important season of all. It was the time of harvest, when every able hand was needed to gather the year's reward. Grain was cut, fruit picked, and vegetables pulled from the soil, filling barns and cellars with food for the months ahead. Relief came with every sack stored safely, for survival through winter depended on these efforts. Autumn was a season of gratitude and urgency, heavy with both work and hope. The harvest itself was a scene of unity. Families and neighbors worked side by side, singing songs, sharing tools, and moving steadily through the fields. The energy was intense but communal, as if the whole village became one body, striving toward the same goal. Laughter mingled with sweat, and though fatigue was heavy, the shared purpose made it bearable. In these days, the village pulsed with a rare joy. Once the fields were cleared, autumn evenings carried a sense of completion. Fires burned brighter, stories were told, and meals were heartier, drawn from the fresh abundance of harvest. For a short time, life felt easier, though everyone knew winter was waiting just ahead. The satisfaction of full barns and secure storage allowed for a rare feeling of comfort, a quiet pride in having endured another cycle of work. Then came winter, with its sharp winds and long nights. The village slowed, fields lay empty, and peasants turned inward to their homes. Survival depended on the stores of grain, dried vegetables, and salted foods prepared earlier. Winter was not only a season of hardship, but also of stillness. When families gathered closer, speaking softly around the fire and enduring the cold together, though winter was feared for hunger and illness, it also carried moments of peace. The silence of snow, the sparkle of frost, and the stillness of frozen streams gave the world a strange beauty. Work did not disappear, animals still needed care, and repairs were always waiting, but the pace was gentler. Winter gave peasants time to mend, reflect, and prepare for the renewal of spring once more. The seasons shaped not only the tasks of peasants, but also their moods and emotions. In spring, hope filled the air as green shoots appeared, promising food after months of scarcity. In summer, weariness mingled with satisfaction, for though the days were long, the fields stood tall with crops. Autumn brought relief, a time when effort was rewarded and gratitude was felt with every sack stored. Winter, though harsh, gave moments of closeness, when families leaned on each other, surviving the dark with patience and care. This cycle created a rhythm deeper than words. The land itself seemed to breathe with the seasons, inhaling growth and exhaling harvest, pausing only in the cold silence of winter. Peasants lived within this breath, aligning their own work to the slow heartbeat of nature. They did not control time, nor did they resist it. Instead, they moved with it, step by step, season by season, finding purpose in repetition. The challenges of each season reminded peasants of their dependence on one another. A poor spring could mean weak crops, requiring neighbors to share seeds. A hot summer could dry the soil, urging families to pool their labor. A thin autumn harvest meant leaner winters, where generosity could save lives. The seasons did not just shape the land, they shaped the bonds between people, weaving them into a community of shared endurance. For children, the turning of the seasons was also a classroom. They learned to recognize the signs of spring in blossoms and bird calls. They grew strong under summer sun, carrying water and helping with animals. They tasted the sweetness of autumn fruits, understanding the joy of harvest. And in winter, they listened to stories by the fire, hearing how their ancestors had faced the same cycles long before. Elders too carried the wisdom of seasons. Their memories stretched back through many winters, many harvests, and many lean years. They taught patience in planting, caution in storing, and endurance in hunger. The young looked to them for guidance, not in books, but in lived experience. Through the cycle of seasons, the past and present met, ensuring survival through knowledge passed quietly down. The rhythm of the seasons was also a rhythm of faith. Though peasants struggled, they knew that life itself, and the food that sustained it, came only by the will of Allah. The sun could shine, the rain could fall, but without his permission, no seed would grow, no harvest would appear. This awareness shaped a humility in their work, a recognition that effort was theirs, but results belonged to the Creator. In this humility, they found strength to continue. The beauty of the seasons was not always grand, but it was deeply felt. The soft green of spring fields, the buzzing warmth of summer air, the golden glow of autumn, and the white silence of winter all gave color to peasant lives. These sights were their art, their landscape, and their comfort. They did not need paintings or grand architecture, for the world itself provided scenes of quiet wonder. In the slow turning of seasons, beauty unfolded daily. The seasons also gave peasants a sense of time's passage. Birthdays were rarely recorded, and calendars were not common, but people marked their lives by planting and harvests. A child born in one spring might walk in the fields by the next. A father remembered how many harvests he had seen, and an elder counted winters endured. This measure of time was not precise, but it was meaningful, grounding human lives in the rhythm of the earth. Even hardship carried lessons through the seasons. Failed harvests taught resilience, storms taught caution, and winters taught the importance of preparation. Every difficulty added to the knowledge of how to endure, strengthening the village for the future. While challenges were heavy, they also deepened the wisdom of the people, shaping not just survival, but character. The rhythm of the seasons was, in this way, also a rhythm of growth for the spirit, and so the seasons turned endlessly, marking the lives of peasants in cycles of labor and rest, fear and hope, scarcity and abundance. They were not merely backdrops to history, but the very framework upon which lives unfolded. To live in a medieval village was to live in step with the earth itself, guided by the steady, patient rhythm of spring, summer, autumn, and winter. As you rest tonight, perhaps you too can feel that slow, gentle rhythm carrying you toward calmness and sleep. To understand the daily life of medieval peasants, we must walk beside them into the open fields, where nearly every day began before the sun had fully risen. Imagine the sky painted in pale shades of pink and grey, dew resting on blades of grass, and the faint mist of morning clinging to the edges of the village. The rooster's crow called families awake, and before long, the paths filled with quiet footsteps as men, women, and even children made their way to the land that sustained them. The work ahead was not glamorous, and it did not change much from day to day, but it was the core of their existence, the task that linked every villager together in a shared struggle for survival. Their fields were not just spaces of soil and crops, they were the foundation of life, the measure of their endurance, and the test of their patience. As you picture them walking with tools in hand, let yourself feel the stillness of that hour, the calm repetition of a life tied completely to the turning of the earth beneath their feet. The tools of their labor were simple, crafted from wood, iron, and sometimes bone, shaped not for beauty but for function. The heavy plow, often drawn by oxen or horses, carved the soil open so that seeds could be sown deep where moisture lingered. Hoes and rakes broke up clods of dirt, while sickles and scythes would later be used for cutting grain at harvest. Each tool carried the marks of constant use, smooth handles polished by calloused hands, blades worn thin from years of sharpening, and wood cracked from sun and rain. These objects did not hold power by themselves, for all usefulness comes only through the permission of Allah, but they were the means through which peasants shaped the land and provided for their families. To the peasants, tools were like companions, reliable only when treated with care, and each morning began with checking, repairing, or carrying them out into the waiting fields. Labor in the fields demanded strength and endurance, but it also required a deep knowledge of the soil, the weather, and the rhythm of nature. A peasant learned not from books, but from years of observation, passed down by parents and elders who had worked the same plots before them. They knew the signs of healthy earth, the way certain weeds revealed moisture levels, or how the flight of birds hinted at changes in weather. Their connection to the land was intimate, not because they owned it. Most peasants did not, but because their survival depended on it. Every handful of soil turned by a plow was a reminder of the fragile balance between effort and result. A single mistake could mean hunger in the winter, and so every action, no matter how repetitive, carried weight. As they bent to their tasks, their movements were careful, steady, and practiced, like the steps of a long and unending dance with the land. Peasants rarely worked alone in the fields, for farming was a communal effort. Families walked together, neighbors lent hands, and even children, when strong enough, joined in with tasks suitable for their age. One person might guide the oxen as they pulled the plow, while another scattered seeds behind them, and another followed with a rake to cover the furrows. Women often carried baskets filled with seed, their steady hands ensuring that nothing was wasted, while children scared birds away from the tender shoots. Older villagers, though slower, gave advice, reminding the younger ones of the best places to plant or how deep to lay the seed. In this way, the work was not only about feeding the village, but also about teaching, bonding, and passing down the skills needed for survival. The field was a classroom, a workplace, and a place of memory, binding generations together through shared effort. The rhythm of the day was shaped by the rising and setting of the sun. In the cool of morning, energy was high, and the sound of tools striking soil echoed across the open air. By midday, the sun grew heavy, pressing down on weary backs and slowing movements to a crawl. Rest was taken in brief moments, often under the shade of a tree or near the edge of a stream, where bread, cheese, or a simple soup might be shared. There were no long breaks, for the land waited for no one, and after only a short pause, work began again. Evening brought some relief, with cooler air and softer light, but it also carried the urgency of finishing tasks before nightfall. When darkness finally covered the fields, peasants walked home slowly, exhausted yet steady, ready to repeat the cycle again the next day. Seasons altered the work, giving variety to what otherwise might seem monotonous. In spring, peasants sowed seeds and repaired fences or tools. In summer, they weeded tirelessly, watched for pests, and ensured livestock were kept fed. Autumn brought the great harvest, when everyone, regardless of age or status, was needed to gather the crops before the weather turned. Winter, though calmer, still required tasks like threshing grain, mending equipment, and preparing for the year ahead. Each season brought different tasks, but all were equally vital, and the peasants moved through them with a patience born of necessity. They did not choose their schedule, but accepted it, knowing the land gave only when treated with steady attention. Livestock were part of the daily work too, and peasants cared for them with the same seriousness given to crops. Cows provided milk, sheep offered wool, and oxen gave the strength needed to pull plows. Chickens supplied eggs, while pigs were raised for meat, though only rarely eaten except on special occasions. These animals were precious, not simply for food, but also for their role in survival, and peasants understood that their care was as important as tending the soil. Feeding, watering, and sheltering them were daily tasks, requiring time and effort that stretched alongside the work of the fields. The usefulness of animals was never taken for granted. for peasants knew they lived only because Allah allowed them to thrive. In their steady care, the bond between human and animal deepened, rooted in dependence and quiet respect. Children's hands, though small, were part of the daily rhythm. They chased birds away from fields, carried water, gathered firewood, and sometimes helped weed the soil. Their chores were lighter than those of adults, but they were important nonetheless, and through them, children learned responsibility from a young age. Play was not absent, but it often mixed with work, rolling wooden hoops down paths, racing to fetch tools, or mimicking the motions of planting. In this way, childhood became both a time of joy and of preparation, ensuring that when they grew older, they could take their place in the endless cycle of labor. Work was never entirely separated from learning, and learning was never fully apart from play. Life itself was the teacher, and the field was the classroom. Though work was demanding, moments of quiet beauty still appeared in the fields. The sight of wildflowers blooming along the edges of crops, the sound of birdsong in the morning air, or the play of sunlight across tall stalks of grain reminded peasants that the world held gentleness even in labor. They did not have paintings hung on their walls or sculptures to admire, but they had the open sky, the shifting clouds, and the daily unfolding of nature's beauty. These small glimpses of wonder softened the weight of hard work, lifting spirits, if only for a moment. To walk through a field was to see the canvas of life itself, drawn not by human hands but by the will of Allah, who set the world in motion. These moments were gifts, scattered quietly amid the toil. The bond between peasants and their land was not based on ownership, but on survival. Most fields belonged to lords or landowners, and peasants worked them not for wealth, but for the right to remain in their homes and provide for their families. Despite this lack of ownership, the connection they felt was strong, for their lives were intertwined with the soil's ability to yield. They knew its strengths and weaknesses, its dryness or dampness, its readiness to give or its stubborn refusal. The land was both a friend and a challenge, generous one year and harsh the next. Through it all, peasants persevered, finding ways to endure and adapt, their footsteps etching invisible lines of devotion across every furrow turned. The field was not theirs to claim, but it was theirs to live within, a truth they accepted with quiet strength. Even with all their effort, peasants knew that their work did not guarantee abundance. A sudden storm could flatten crops, a swarm of insects could devour fields, or a drought could crack the soil into useless dust. These hardships were reminders that while human hands worked the land, the results were never fully in their control. They believed that survival was possible only by the will of Allah, who allowed seeds to sprout, rains to fall, and life to continue. This awareness humbled them, for it kept their perspective clear. Their labor mattered, but it was never the final deciding force. In this balance of effort and reliance, peasants built patience, carrying on even when uncertainty pressed heavily against them. Each sunrise was both a promise and a test, and they met it with steady footsteps into the fields, trusting that persistence itself was part of their duty. The routine of fieldwork created a rhythm that shaped not only their days, but also their very sense of identity. To be a peasant was to be someone who worked the land, who rose with the sun, bent with the soil, and ended each day with weary but honest hands. Their lives did not change dramatically from year to year, yet in that constancy they found stability. The same furrows ploughed by a father would be followed by his son, and then by his grandson, each generation walking the same paths. This continuity bound them together, reminding them that they were part of a story larger than their own lifetimes. The earth was both their workplace and their inheritance, linking them to the past and the future in a chain that seemed unbroken. The rhythm was not fast, but it was enduring, and in its endurance, they found meaning. Harvest season was perhaps the most demanding part of field work. Once the crops ripened, every moment mattered, for delay could mean losing food to storms, birds, or rot. Villagers worked from dawn until night, scythes swinging in wide arcs as stalks of grain fell in golden waves. Bundles were tied and carried to carts, children followed with baskets of fallen ears, and neighbors called out to one another across the fields. Though exhaustion pressed against them, there was also a kind of joy in the abundance gathered. Harvest was a celebration of effort meeting result, a time when barns filled and worries eased, if only for a while. These days of gathering were etched deeply into memory, for they carried both relief and pride, the visible reward of countless hours of labor. Even in harvest, work did not end with gathering. The grain had to be threshed, separating seeds from husks, often by beating bundles against wooden frames or trampling them underfoot. Winnowing followed, tossing grain into the air so that the wind carried away chaff, leaving behind the heavier seeds. These processes were repetitive and tiring, yet they were crucial, for they transformed raw crops into food that could last through the winter. Families often worked late into the night, firelight flickering as shadows bent across the fields. In these hours, the village hummed with activity, every household contributing to the shared survival of the community. The sound of threshing carried like a heartbeat through the night air, steady and unrelenting. In the quieter months, when planting or harvesting paused, fieldwork still remained. Fences needed mending, ditches cleared, and tools sharpened. Livestock had to be fed and sheltered, manure spread across fields to enrich the soil, and weeds pulled even when crops were not yet sprouting. These tasks were less urgent but no less necessary, for they ensured that when the seasons turned again, the fields would be ready. There was no true rest from responsibility, only changes in its shape. The peasants understood this and moved steadily through the year, never allowing neglect to undo the effort already invested. Even in slower days, the field demanded attention, as if reminding them that survival was always a task without end. Work in the fields also shaped the social life of the village. Side by side, neighbors shared conversation, stories, and sometimes even songs as they labored. The rhythm of tools striking soil often became a rhythm for voices, blending talk with work until the two were inseparable. Friendships were strengthened in these moments, for hardship shared became easier to endure. Conflicts, too, sometimes rose in the strain of long days, but just as often, they dissolved in the need to rely on one another. The field was not only a place of labor, but also a place of human connection, where laughter and struggle existed together. In this way, work bound the village together, not just through survival, but also through companionship. Women's labor in the fields was as essential as that of men. While men often plowed or reaped, women sowed seeds, weeded, gathered produce, and carried loads back to the village. Their work extended beyond the fields into the home, where they prepared meals, spun wool, and cared for children. Far from being secondary, their contribution formed half of the strength that kept the village alive. A household could not endure without the combined effort of every member, and women balanced both domestic and agricultural tasks with quiet resilience. Their strength was often unrecognized in records, but it was felt every day in the survival of their families. In truth, the field was a place of shared responsibility, where both men and women played vital roles. The exhaustion of daily work was deep, yet peasants endured it with patience. Their bodies grew strong from constant labor, though injuries and weariness were common. Hands grew calloused, backs bent with age, and joints stiffened long before old age arrived. Yet even in this, there was acceptance, for life demanded such sacrifice. The wear on their bodies was the mark of their contribution, proof of their role in sustaining not only their families, but also the entire society that rested upon their shoulders. Fatigue was a companion, but so too was endurance, and in that balance they found a steady path forward. As evening drew near, peasants walked home from the fields with tools over their shoulders, their shadows stretching long across the dirt paths. The air cooled, and the sounds of labor faded into the quiet of crickets and the low murmur of families gathering indoors. Smoke curled upward from chimneys, carrying the smell of soup or bread, and children's voices softened as they settled into rest. The fields lay still again, marked only by the furrows and footprints left behind, silent witnesses to the day's efforts. Tomorrow, the same cycle would begin, unchanged and unbroken. But in that moment of evening calm, peasants allowed themselves the rare comfort of stillness, listening to the silence of the land that both demanded and sustained their lives. In reflecting on the daily work of the fields, one sees not only the struggle but also the strength of medieval peasants. Their labor was repetitive, heavy, and constant, yet it was also steady, meaningful, and essential. They lived in close partnership with the soil, not through choice but through necessity, and in that partnership they built resilience. The rhythm of their work echoed through generations, a pattern as ancient as the earth itself. Though centuries have passed, their story remains, whispering through history of lives lived with patience, endurance, and quiet determination. Tonight, as we close this picture of daily fieldwork, let the rhythm of their steps and the steadiness of their toil guide you gently toward rest, like the slow turning of the earth itself. Step with me now from the open fields into the narrow paths of the village, and from there into the doorway of a medieval peasant's home. At first glance, you might be surprised by its simplicity, for there are no painted walls, no shining ornaments, and no furniture carved with elegance. Instead, the space is practical, designed for survival and little more. The cottage is small, often with only 1 or 2 rooms, its low roof made of thatch, and its walls pressed together from wood, mud, or woven branches. Smoke curls faintly from a central fire, darkening the ceiling beams above, and the air smells of straw, earth, and the faint scent of cooked grain. This is not luxury, but it is life, and for the peasants who lived here, it was enough. The floor beneath your feet is hard-packed earth, uneven and rough, swept only with bundles of twigs. Sometimes straw is scattered across it, not for decoration but to absorb dampness and soften footsteps. There are no tiles, no polished boards, only the living soil beneath the home, the same soil that supports the fields outside. The walls are bare, without pictures or paint, but lined with practical items, hooks for tools, pegs for clothes, and shelves built crudely for storing pots or wooden bowls. The roof above, though fragile, keeps most of the rain away, though in storms, water sometimes drips through, reminding the family of their vulnerability. Yet even this shelter, imperfect and plain, offers safety from wind and cold. At the center of the home lies the hearth, a fire kept alive as much as possible, for it is the only source of heat. The smoke escapes slowly through a hole in the roof or through cracks in the thatch, leaving the interior dim and hazy. The fire is more than warmth. It is where food is cooked, water boiled, and families gather in the evenings. Flames themselves have no power of their own, for only Allah gives fire the ability to warm or cook, but for peasants, the hearth was a lifeline. Around it, children played, meals simmered in iron pots, and light glowed softly against the darkness. Without the hearth, the home would be cold and lifeless. Furniture is scarce. A rough wooden table may stand near the hearth, its surface uneven and marked with years of use. Stools or benches replace chairs, often built from whatever timber could be spared. Beds are simple frames filled with straw or reeds, covered with woolen blankets if the family was fortunate, or with animal skins if they were not. A chest, if one could be afforded, stored clothing, blankets, or small valuables, sometimes doubling as a seat. Each piece was made not for comfort, but for necessity, serving multiple purposes in a small space. There was little room for excess. The sleeping arrangements were modest and communal. Families often shared a single room, with parents, children, and sometimes even animals resting close together for warmth. Privacy was almost unknown, for survival demanded closeness. Straw mattresses were replaced when damp or worn, but often they carried the scent of smoke, sweat, and earth. In winter, bodies pressed close, conserving heat through the long nights. For children, these nights were filled with the soft sound of crackling fire and the steady breathing of family. Though small and crowded, such closeness brought a kind of comfort, even within hardship. Light inside the home came mostly from the fire, or from small oil lamps or candles if the family could afford them. The flicker of flame painted the walls with shadows, creating an atmosphere both warm and dim. Windows, if present at all, were tiny and covered with oiled cloth or thin wooden shutters, letting in only the faintest daylight. The interior was often dark, especially in winter, when daylight hours were short. Peasants learned to live with this dimness, their eyes adjusting to shadow, their movements guided by memory more than sight. Light was a gift, not a guarantee. Storage was always a challenge in such small spaces. Grains were kept in sacks or bins, hanging from rafters to keep them from dampness and mice. Vegetables like onions or garlic were braided and hung from beams, drying slowly in the smoky air. Tools leaned against walls, pots and pans crowded near the hearth, and clothing was folded into wooden chests. Every corner of the room served a purpose, no space wasted, for survival demanded efficiency. The home might appear cluttered, but it was a clutter shaped by necessity, not choice. The air inside was thick with mixed scents. Smoke lingered constantly, settling into hair and fabric, making everything smell of wood and ash. Food added its aromas to simmering with beans or cabbage, bread baking on the hearthstone, or dried herbs hanging from beams. The scent of animals sometimes drifted in as well, for livestock were often kept in small adjoining shelters, or even inside the home during harsh winters. The mixture may seem unpleasant to modern noses, but to peasants, it was the smell of daily life, familiar and unremarkable. To them, it was the fragrance of survival itself. Sounds filled the small space just as much as scents. The crackle of fire, the creak of wooden beams, the clatter of pots being stirred, and the murmur of voices blended into a constant backdrop. Children whispered or played, babies cried, and older family members shared stories or advice. Outside, chickens clucked or cows lowed, their noises slipping easily through thin walls. There was rarely silence, but the sounds were gentle, woven into the rhythm of daily living. These were the sounds that lulled children to sleep and reminded adults of their responsibilities. Despite the harshness, the peasant's home was also a place of comfort. It was where meals were shared, where warmth was gathered, and where families held one another close against the uncertainty of the world outside. It may have been small, smoky, and bare, but it carried the weight of love, memory, and resilience. Within its walls, parents raised children, elders told stories, and lives unfolded with patience. The home was not grand, but it was enough, and its simplicity gave strength to those who called it theirs. For peasants, home was never about wealth, it was about survival, togetherness, and quiet endurance. The walls of a peasant's home told silent stories, though not through paintings or tapestries. Instead, they bore the marks of smoke stains, rough repairs, and the constant press of daily life. Wooden beams sagged slightly under years of weight, and mud plaster cracked with the shift of seasons. Children's hands left faint smudges along low surfaces, while tools hung ready, waiting for the next day's work. These imperfections were not flaws, but reminders that the house was alive with use. Every line, every dent, and every scar spoke of endurance, of families who had weathered winters, storms, and hardships under the same roof. It was not beauty that made the home meaningful, but the quiet record of lives lived within it. Inside these cottages, daily routines unfolded with slow repetition. Morning began with the rekindling of the fire, sometimes using embers buried deep in ashes overnight to preserve a spark. Breakfast was simple, often just coarse bread dipped in broth or milk, before family members scattered to their tasks in fields or workshops. The house emptied during daylight hours, standing in silence while its occupants labored outside. By evening, footsteps returned, tools clattered into corners, and the air filled once again with voices and cooking smoke. This daily rhythm gave the home a heartbeat, steady and unchanging, guiding life through the cycle of day and night. In times of illness, the home became a place of care and waiting. Without modern medicine, peasants relied on herbs, poultices, and rest to heal, hoping for recovery by Allah's mercy. The hearth warmed the sick, while family members offered food, water, or whispered prayers beside them. The home, though small, became a shelter for fragility, holding not only bodies, but also the emotions of fear, hope, and patience. Neighbors sometimes entered to help, bringing broth, herbs, or assistance with chores. In these moments, the walls witnessed the tenderness of survival, where the line between life and loss felt painfully thin. Celebrations also found their place in these modest rooms. After harvest, families might gather for a small feast, laying bread, cheese, and whatever else they could spare upon the table. Music was simple, perhaps the strum of a lute or the rhythm of clapping hands, but it filled the smoky air with joy. Laughter echoed against the rough walls, carrying warmth deeper than the fire's heat. Children played near the hearth, their games illuminated by candlelight, while elders shared stories of years gone by. Though resources were limited, happiness was not absent. It simply took smaller, quieter forms, shaped by gratitude rather than grandeur. The peasant home also carried the wisdom of resourcefulness. Nothing went to waste. Scraps of wood became handles or pegs, broken pots were patched with metal, and worn clothing was repaired again and again. Old straw from bedding was spread in fields as fertilizer, while ashes from the hearth were used for cleaning. Every object was valued, not for its appearance but for its function, and families learned to stretch each resource to its limit. This frugality was not a choice but a necessity, teaching patience and ingenuity in equal measure. The home stood as a workshop of survival, where creativity emerged from scarcity. Children grew up within these walls, absorbing lessons not through books but through observation. They watched parents spin wool, patch roofs, stir pots, and mend tools. They learned where herbs were stored, how fires were tended, and which sounds meant danger outside. Their education was woven into the fabric of the home itself, its every corner serving as a classroom. By the time they were grown, these lessons were second nature, ensuring that they too could maintain a household and raise a family. The home was not just a shelter but a teacher, shaping each new generation through constant repetition of daily tasks. At night, the home took on a different character. With doors barred and shutters closed, families drew close around the hearth, the only light flickering against walls. Shadows danced across beams, voices softened, and the outside world faded into silence. Parents spoke quietly, children dozed, and the fire burned low, its warmth stretching only as far as those gathered nearby. The night was long, yet within the home there was a sense of safety, however fragile. Outside, the village slept together, but each cottage held its own small universe of dreams and memories. The peasant home was never isolated from the world beyond its walls. Smoke, rising from its chimney, joined the smoke of other cottages, weaving a common thread across the village sky. The sounds of neighboring families drifted through thin walls and open windows, reminding everyone that they were part of a larger community. When storms struck, all homes shuddered together, and when celebrations rose, all homes brightened with shared joy. Each cottage, though small, was one piece of the whole, linked by shared struggles and shared endurance. In its simplicity, the peasant's home revealed the essence of life, stripped to its most basic needs. Shelter, warmth, food, family, these were the pillars upon which everything rested. There were no luxuries, no vast decorations, yet there was meaning in every corner. The home may not have dazzled with riches, but it carried the strength of quiet survival. For those who lived within it, the small cottage was enough, a place where hardship could be met with resilience, and where love could bloom even in the narrowest spaces. Its plain walls held more value than gold, for they sheltered life itself. And so, when we step back from the hearth, the straw beds, the smoky air, and the voices echoing softly inside, we understand more deeply what it meant to live as a peasant. Their homes were not built to impress, but to endure, to hold warmth against the cold and family against the hardships of life. They were fragile, often uncomfortable, yet filled with strength and meaning. Tonight, as you picture these simple cottages, perhaps you can allow their quiet steadiness to guide you toward your own rest. For just as those families once closed their doors and settled into sleep, so too can you now, letting the image of their humble homes carry you softly into dreams. To truly understand the daily life of peasants, we must step into their kitchens, or, more accurately, into the small space around the hearth where food was prepared. There were no ovens with metal doors, no polished tables, and no cupboards filled with jars and spices. Instead, the tools were simple: an iron pot hanging over the fire, a wooden spoon for stirring, and a stone or clay surface for baking bread. Food was not about luxury or indulgence, it was about survival. Every meal reflected the limits of what the land could give, shaped by the seasons, by the weather, and by the will of Allah, who alone allowed crops and animals to sustain life. In these modest kitchens, families shared meals that were plain, repetitive, yet essential to their strength. Bread was the centerpiece of peasant diets, often coarse and dark in color. Made from barley, rye, or oats, it was heavy, dense, and sometimes flavored with a faint sourness from rough fermentation. Wheat bread existed, but was a luxury reserved for the wealthy, rarely tasted by peasants, except in special circumstances. Families baked loaves on heated stones, or even in communal ovens when villagers shared resources. Bread filled stomachs, providing energy for long days in the fields. It was not soft or refined, but it was the daily companion of every peasant household. Alongside bread came pottage, a thick stew made from whatever vegetables, grains, or herbs were available. Into the pot went beans, cabbage, onions, leeks, or turnips, simmered slowly over the fire until soft. Sometimes oats or barley thickened the mixture, creating a dish that was hearty if not flavorful. Meat was rarely added, for it was expensive and often reserved for festivals or special gatherings. Instead, the taste of pottage depended on what the garden or fields could provide at that time. Though humble, it was the meal that carried families through countless days. Vegetables formed the backbone of the diet. Gardens near cottages grew hardy plants that could withstand the local soil and climate. Peas, beans, onions, garlic, cabbages, and leeks. Herbs like parsley or dill added occasional flavor, though seasonings were limited. Each harvest was carefully measured, for the winter months would rely heavily on stored vegetables. Families dried, salted, or preserved what they could, always aware that scarcity might follow if supplies ran short. The rhythm of planting and harvesting determined not only survival but also the taste of every meal. Dairy products provided variety when available. Cows, goats, or sheep gave milk, which was often turned into butter or cheese. Fresh milk did not last long without cooling, so peasants quickly transformed it into forms that could be stored longer. Cheese, hard or soft, added nourishment to bread or pottage, while butter gave rare richness to otherwise plain meals. These dairy items were valuable, not only for nutrition but also for trade within the village. Though not eaten in abundance, they were treasured whenever they appeared on the table. Eggs were another source of food, gathered from chickens that roamed the village yards. A few eggs could be boiled, mixed into pottage, or fried on hot stones. They were small gifts of nourishment, appearing irregularly depending on the health and care of the flock. Chickens were precious for their steady supply, so families guarded them carefully, understanding that each egg was a step toward sustaining life. Eggs might not have been daily fare, but when they appeared, they were welcomed gratefully. Their presence reminded peasants of the small but meaningful blessings hidden in ordinary routines. Meat was rare on the peasant table. Most animals were too valuable alive to be killed for food, as cows gave milk, sheep gave wool, and oxen gave strength in the fields. Pigs and chickens were more often eaten, but only occasionally, usually during celebrations, religious festivals, or when animals could no longer serve their purpose. The taste of roasted meat was a treat, savored slowly, its memory lasting long after the bones were picked clean. For many peasants, months could pass without a bite of meat, and its absence was accepted as part of life. Meals were designed not for indulgence, but for survival. Fish, however, sometimes found its way to the table. Streams, rivers, and ponds near villages offered catches of trout, eel, or carp. Fish could be eaten fresh, smoked, or salted for longer storage. Families living near the coast or larger rivers had greater access, though even then, fish was a luxury compared to bread and vegetables. Still, it provided valuable nutrition and variety when available. Its presence on the table was a reminder of the land and water working together under Allah's will to provide sustenance for human life. Meals were often eaten communally, with families gathered around the hearth or wooden table. Food was placed in shared bowls or pots, and each person used a wooden spoon or their hands. Plates were uncommon, and knives were personal items carried at the belt rather than provided at the table. Children ate beside parents, learning manners and patience in the process. Conversation was minimal, for hunger encouraged silence, but the act of sharing bound families together. A meal was not only nourishment but also a reminder of unity, reinforcing bonds with every bite. The flavors of peasant meals were plain, shaped more by necessity than creativity. Salt was precious, pepper was rare, and sugar was almost unknown outside wealthy households. Meals tasted of earth, smoke, and the natural sharpness of vegetables. This simplicity might seem dull today, but it carried the satisfaction of survival. To a peasant, fullness mattered more than flavor, and the warmth of food on a cold night mattered more than its taste. Meals were modest, but they were anchors of life, connecting body and spirit to the rhythm of each day. In times of scarcity, meals became even plainer. A loaf of bread might be stretched for several days, softened with water or broth when it grew hard. Pottage thinned into watery soup, with only a few vegetables floating in it, more liquid than substance. Families relied on whatever could be gathered: wild herbs, berries, or nuts from the forest, roots dug from the soil, or even acorns prepared carefully to remove their bitterness. Hunger was a familiar guest, and though never welcome, it was endured with patience, for peasants understood that life was fragile and uncertain. These lean meals reminded them of their dependence on Allah's mercy, for only He could turn poor soil into abundance again. The way food was preserved also shaped the peasant diet. Grains were stored in sacks or bins, sometimes suspended from rafters to keep out rodents. Vegetables were dried, salted, or stored in cellars dug into the earth, where the cool air kept them longer. Meat and fish, when available, were smoked over fires or salted heavily to last through the cold months. Dairy, like butter and cheese, was crafted precisely because fresh milk spoiled so quickly. Every preservation method was a battle against time, an attempt to carry today's harvest into tomorrow's hunger. Without these practices, winter survival would have been nearly impossible. The relationship peasants had with food was practical rather than indulgent. Meals were valued not for variety but for nourishment, for their ability to give strength to tired bodies. Hunger after long hours in the field made even coarse bread feel satisfying. Gratitude came not from flavor but from the simple fact of having something to eat. There was no thought of recipes or delicacies, only of survival and endurance. The act of eating was less about pleasure and more about continuing the work of life, one bowl of pottage at a time. Festive days brought rare exceptions to the monotony. During harvest celebrations or weddings, villagers pooled resources to create larger meals. Bread might be baked in greater quantities, stews enriched with bits of meat, and ale brewed to share. Neighbors gathered, laughter filled the air, and for a short time, food was abundant and joy was shared openly. These moments stood out in memory, breaking the cycle of plain meals with rare feasts. Though brief, they carried hope, reminding peasants that life also held sweetness amid struggle. Children's relationship with food was shaped by these realities. They learned early not to waste, not to leave a crust of bread unfinished or a spoonful of pottage untouched. Hunger taught them respect for every grain and gratitude for every small gift of food. They watched their parents divide meals carefully, ensuring fairness even when portions were small. In these lessons, children grew to understand that food was sacred in its necessity, never to be taken lightly. This awareness became part of their character, shaping how they viewed both work and survival. The rhythm of meals reflected the rhythm of the day. A small breakfast, often just bread or porridge, gave strength for the morning's labor. Midday meals were heavier, eaten quickly in the fields if work demanded it. Evening brought the main meal, shared by the hearth, where families finally rested together. The cycle repeated endlessly, season after season, a steady pattern that structured both work and rest. Even meals themselves became markers of time, binding the days together in quiet repetition. The simplicity of food mirrored the simplicity of peasant lives. Just as their homes were modest and their clothing practical, their meals carried no excess, only what was needed. This did not mean their lives lacked meaning. Rather, it meant that meaning was found in the basics. Bread, pottage, vegetables, milk, and the occasional egg or piece of meat, these were enough. They sustained life, nurtured families, and gave strength to endure the endless labor of the fields. In that steadiness lay a different kind of richness, one measured not by flavor but by survival. When famine struck, the reality of food's importance became painfully clear. Crops failed, animals grew thin, and meals shrank until they were barely meals at all. Families sometimes boiled weeds or chewed bark to quiet their hunger. These times tested the endurance of entire villages, forcing them to share, to ration, and to rely on the strength of their bonds. Yet even in famine, peasants carried on, trusting that relief would eventually come, just as spring always followed winter. These trials were harsh, but they also deepened resilience, reminding everyone of the fragile thread upon which survival hung. The act of eating together carried more meaning than the food itself. Gathered around the fire, peasants shared not only bread and pottage, but also conversation, stories, and silence. The warmth of togetherness softened the harshness of plain meals, turning necessity into comfort. Hunger felt less heavy when borne as a family, and satisfaction felt greater when shared with neighbors. The table, however bare, became a place of connection, where life's struggles were carried together. In this way, meals were not only about feeding the body, but also about nourishing the spirit. And so, when we reflect on the food of medieval peasants, we see a diet that was plain, repetitive, and modest, yet also sustaining and steady. Their meals were not feasts of kings, but they were enough to keep life moving, day by day, year by year. Bread, pottage, vegetables, dairy, and the occasional gifts of meat or fish carried them through both plenty and scarcity. These meals were the quiet backbone of survival, shaping bodies, families, and communities alike. Tonight, as you rest, perhaps you too can find peace in the thought of such simple nourishment meals that, though humble, gave life its strength. Family was the foundation of peasant life, the first circle of support in a world where survival depended on cooperation. Within the modest walls of a cottage, parents, children, and sometimes grandparents lived together, each person carrying a role shaped by necessity. The household was not divided into private spaces, but into shared responsibilities, where everyone's effort mattered. Fathers often guided the heaviest work in the fields, while mothers managed the home, tended gardens, and joined in agricultural tasks when needed. Children learned by doing, their small hands helping with chores, their eyes watching elders closely. Life was demanding, yet family provided comfort, giving peasants strength to face each day. Children were not idle, even from a young age. They fetched water, gathered wood, and scared birds away from the fields. As they grew older, they carried heavier tasks, herding animals, weeding gardens, or helping repair tools. Childhood was brief, not shielded from responsibility, but woven into it. Yet in this, children gained a sense of belonging, for their contributions were valued, no matter how small. Their laughter still filled the village paths, but always against the backdrop of work. Through family life, they were shaped into the next generation of peasants, inheriting both hardship and resilience. Mothers bore much of the unseen weight within families. They prepared meals, spun wool, mended clothing, and cared for children, all while joining their husbands in the fields when extra labor was needed. Their work stretched across every corner of life, balancing household tasks with agricultural demands. They were the quiet managers of survival, ensuring that food was stretched, resources were shared wisely, and children were taught the patience needed for endurance. Records of history rarely named them, yet their role was constant, vital, and irreplaceable. Without mothers, families could not have held together through the long seasons of struggle. Fathers carried the burden of heavy labor, guiding oxen through the fields, repairing plows, and ensuring that the land was tended. They also taught sons the skills of farming, passing down knowledge of soil, weather, and planting cycles. Their strength shaped the survival of households, though their role was not solitary. In moments of scarcity, fathers relied on wives, children, and neighbors to share the load. The family was not divided into separate paths, but intertwined roles, where each person's endurance supported the whole. The presence of fathers gave structure, but it was the combined effort of all that truly sustained life. Grandparents, when still alive, often remained within the household, offering guidance shaped by experience. Their physical strength may have faded, but their memories carried value. They taught remedies for illness, methods of preservation, and the wisdom of endurance. Children listened to their stories, gaining not only entertainment, but lessons of resilience. In this way, elders remained essential, reminding families of continuity, that survival was not new but part of a long chain of struggle and strength. The presence of grandparents gave depth to family life, rooting each generation in memory. Meals were times when family bonds were most visible. Gathered around the hearth, parents divided food carefully, ensuring that everyone had enough, even in times of scarcity. Conversations flowed in quiet tones, children listened, and warmth spread not only from the fire, but from the closeness of shared living. These moments of togetherness gave meaning to the hardships endured outside. The taste of bread and pottage was softened by the presence of family, turning necessity into comfort. Eating together reminded peasants that they did not face struggles alone. Community extended beyond the household, shaping village life as much as family did. Neighbors shared tools, animals, and labor, for no family could survive on its own. If one family's ox fell ill, another might lend theirs. During harvest, all hands worked together to bring in crops before the weather turned. When illness struck, food was brought, and chores were shared. The village was a net of support, woven from necessity, but also from the quiet strength of human bonds. Without community, families would have been too vulnerable to endure the unpredictability of the world. Trust was the currency of village life. Promises carried weight, for broken trust could mean the difference between survival and hardship. Neighbors depended on one another for borrowing grain, tools, or animals, knowing repayment might come later. Gossip and reputation traveled quickly, shaping how cooperation was offered. A good name was as valuable as any possession, for it determined the willingness of others to stand beside you in times of need. Community thrived when trust was preserved, and faltered when it was broken. Festivals and gatherings revealed the strength of family and community bonds. Though resources were limited, villagers came together to share food, music, and laughter, celebrating the rare moments when work paused. Weddings, harvest feasts, or even small communal prayers became chances to renew relationships. Children played freely, adults exchanged stories, and elders smiled at the continuation of traditions. These events stitched families and neighbors together more tightly, reminding everyone that joy could still exist within hardship. In these celebrations, the village found not escape, but renewal of spirit. The roles within family and community were balanced by necessity, not by choice. Each person gave what they could, each received what they needed, and together they created stability in an unstable world. The family provided shelter, love, and discipline, while the community provided cooperation, protection, and unity. Neither could stand without the other. To live as a peasant was to live within these bonds, accepting that strength came not from the individual but from the collective. In this truth, families endured and villages survived. Conflict sometimes tested the strength of both family and community. Arguments over land boundaries, borrowed tools, or shared resources could grow sharp, for survival left little room for generosity when supplies were scarce. Yet, even in these tensions, solutions had to be found, for neighbors could not live in constant hostility. Families leaned on one another to ease quarrels, and elders often stepped in as mediators, their voices carrying authority shaped by years of experience. Disputes rarely ended in permanent division, for the need to survive bound everyone together more firmly than pride could tear them apart. Conflict was part of life, but cooperation was its conclusion. Illness and hardship deepened reliance on family bonds. When one member of a household grew weak, the others shouldered more of the burden, tending the sick and completing their tasks in the fields. If the hardship was too great, neighbors stepped in, bringing food or labor as acts of quiet solidarity. A family struck by misfortune was never truly alone, for the community carried part of their struggle. This network of care reflected the shared understanding that survival was not an individual triumph but a collective effort. In this way, hardship revealed the strength of the bonds within both family and community. Children grew within these circles, learning not only the skills of farming but also the lessons of cooperation. They saw their parents borrow tools, return favors, and help neighbors with building or harvest. They watched disputes resolved, meals shared, and laughter exchanged. These observations became part of their upbringing, teaching them that survival was built on trust, fairness, and unity. The values of community were as important as the knowledge of soil or livestock, shaping children into adults ready to carry the same responsibilities. Thus, each generation inherited not only land and labor, but also the wisdom of collective endurance. The village itself acted like an extended family. Though not bound by blood, neighbors were bound by necessity, creating ties as strong as kinship. A child lost parents, and the village stepped in. A widow needed firewood, and neighbors gathered to provide it. A sick elder could no longer cook, and families delivered meals. This shared responsibility blurred the lines between family and community until the two became nearly inseparable. The village was not just a place of residence but a body of shared life, breathing together through hardship and hope. Marriage linked families into larger networks, expanding connections across the village. A wedding was not only a celebration but also a weaving together of resources, labor, and kinship. Families gained allies through these bonds, creating webs of obligation and support that stretched across generations. Children born from these unions tied households even more firmly to one another, ensuring that the future of the village remained interwoven. In this way, marriage was less about romance than about survival, strengthening the collective fabric that kept the village whole. Through these ties, families grew into communities that could withstand the unpredictability of life. Faith, too, was practiced within family and community. guiding their patience and resilience. Gratitude for food, endurance through hardship, and the rhythm of daily prayer shaped how peasants endured life's burdens. Faith reminded them that all provision came only by Allah's will, whether through crops in the field or kindness from a neighbor. Families passed these values to children not through books but through lived example, showing them how to accept scarcity with patience and abundance with humility. The community, bound together by these shared beliefs, found strength in unity that stretched beyond material survival. Seasonal tasks often became communal events, where families worked side by side to achieve what no single household could manage alone. Harvest, planting, and building projects turned the village into a hive of activity, buzzing with cooperation. Each hand, young or old, added to the collective effort, and the success of one family became the success of all. These moments highlighted the truth that community survival depended on unity. They also brought a sense of pride, for in these days of shared labor, the village felt alive with purpose and strength. Cooperation transformed struggle into achievement, reminding peasants that together they could endure. Evenings reflected the closeness of family and community bonds. After work ended, families gathered inside their homes, but the village itself remained connected by sound and presence. Laughter drifted through open shutters, children's voices echoed across paths, and the smoke of many fires rose together into the night sky. It was as if the whole village breathed in rhythm, each household a part of a larger whole. These evenings were simple, quiet, and repetitive, but they created a sense of belonging that endured through generations. The comfort of family extended outward, shaping the comfort of community. Through family and community, peasants endured challenges that might otherwise have broken them. Their homes may have been fragile, their food plain, and their lives heavy with labor, but within these bonds, they found resilience. A family's closeness gave strength, while the villagers' unity offered protection. These connections were not luxuries, but lifelines, without which survival would have been impossible. In this truth, family and community became the unseen walls holding life together, stronger than stone or timber. They were the quiet foundation of medieval existence. And so, when we reflect on the peasants' lives, it becomes clear that their true wealth was not in coins or possessions, but in relationships. Parents guiding children, neighbors helping neighbors, families joining through marriage, and villagers breathing together as one. These were the treasures that sustained them. Their endurance was built not on isolation but on unity, and their story whispers to us even now that survival, whether in the past or present, is strongest when shared. Tonight, as you rest, perhaps you too can find comfort in this thought that in bonds of family and community there lies a quiet strength capable of carrying us all. In medieval Europe, peasants lived not only for their families and communities, but also under the authority of a landowner, often called the Lord of the Manor. The land on which they built their homes and planted their crops did not belong to them, but to the Lord, whose family had held power over the territory for generations. In exchange for the right to live and farm, peasants owed duties both in labor and in goods. This relationship was the framework of society, shaping the rhythm of peasant life as much as the seasons did. To be a peasant was to understand that part of your work, no matter how hard, would always go to someone else. The duties were many and varied. Some peasants owed days of labor, known as week work, where they left their own fields to toil in the Lord's lands. Others paid with goods, delivering sacks of grain, baskets of vegetables, or livestock from their herds. Taxes, fees, and fines could also be demanded, turning even the smallest transaction into an obligation. Though burdensome, these duties were accepted as part of life, for peasants had little power to refuse. To live on the land meant to carry its weight, both in harvest and in obligation. Working the Lord's land was often exhausting, for it came on top of the peasant's own labor. A man might spend the morning plowing fields for his family, only to spend the afternoon plowing fields for his lord. Women who spun wool or gathered vegetables at home might also be called to help during harvests on the manor's estates. Children, too, were sometimes pulled into these duties, their small hands contributing where needed. Time was precious, yet it was divided, with part of it always reserved for the demands of the manor. For peasants, this balance was never easy, but it was inescapable. Beyond farming, duties included a variety of tasks that kept the manor running. Peasants mended fences, dug ditches, repaired roads, and maintained bridges. They cut firewood for the Lord's hall, tended his animals, and carried loads when needed. Some were required to grind grain at the Lord's mill, bake bread in his oven, or press grapes in his winepress, each with a fee or portion owed to the Lord. Daily life was filled not only with personal labor, but also with service to someone higher. The weight of these duties pressed heavily, but peasants endured, for refusal was not an option. Rent was another form of obligation. Though peasants lived in cottages they built themselves, the land beneath their homes belonged to the manor. Payment was often demanded in goods or labor, binding families more deeply to the system. Even marriage or inheritance could carry a fee, with peasants paying for the right to pass on land or wed within the manor's domain. Every step of life was marked by these duties, turning ordinary events into reminders of dependence. Freedom was limited, tethered by obligations that reached into every corner of existence. Yet not all duties were equal. Wealthier peasants, sometimes called yeomen, might owe fewer days of labor, but more in goods or money, while poorer peasants, known as serfs, gave more time in the fields. This created a hierarchy even within the village, with some families slightly freer and others bound tightly to service. Still, all peasants shared the same reality. The Lord's authority stretched over them, shaping their choices and limiting their independence. The system was unequal, but it was deeply ingrained, accepted as the way the world was ordered. To imagine life without it was nearly impossible. The manor itself was a symbol of this authority. Rising above the village, sometimes as a fortified hall or even a castle, it reminded peasants daily of the power that governed their lives. Its walls stood tall while their cottages leaned, its fires burned brighter while their hearths smoked faintly. To see the manor was to remember duty, a visual anchor of the system that shaped their existence. Yet it also represented stability, for as long as the Lord ruled, protection was promised, and the village had its place. The manor loomed not only as power, but also as permanence. The relationship between peasants and their lord was complex. On one hand, it was marked by inequality and burden, with peasants carrying the weight of duties that enriched someone else. On the other hand, it offered a form of security, for the lord was responsible for protecting his lands and the people who worked them. Raids, bandits, and wars threatened villages, but the manor's defenses gave some measure of safety. This duality, burden and protection, was at the heart of the feudal bond. For peasants, acceptance of duties was tied not only to necessity, but also to survival. Ceremonies reinforced these obligations. When a new lord inherited land, peasants might gather to swear loyalty, acknowledging his rule in exchange for continued rights to farm. Oaths, though simple, carried great weight, binding villagers into the structure of feudal life. Festivals or gatherings sometimes highlighted the bond, with peasants offering gifts of grain or animals as symbols of service. These rituals reminded everyone of their place, weaving duty into tradition. Even celebrations carried the shadow of obligation, never letting peasants forget the hierarchy above them. And so, the daily life of peasants was never their own alone. Their work fed their families but also filled the Lord's stores. Their labor shaped their survival but also supported the wealth of another. Duties tied them to the land and to the system of feudal authority, as tightly as roots bound trees to the soil. Acceptance was not about choice, but about endurance, for peasants had little power to alter their fate. This reality shaped their lives, steady and unchanging, a constant reminder that to live in the medieval world was to live under obligation. Peasants often felt the weight of these duties most keenly during harvest. When the fruits of their labor were divided, a family might spend weeks in the fields, cutting grain and stacking bundles, only to see a significant portion taken as tax or rent. The sight of carts carrying harvests to the manor's storehouses was both familiar and painful. Yet peasants knew resistance was dangerous, for the authority of the Lord was supported by law, custom, and force. Submission was the safer path, and survival depended on compliance. Even so, the quiet longing for more freedom lived in the hearts of many, whispered in private but rarely spoken aloud. In addition to taxes and labor, peasants were subject to banal rights. These were fees charged for using the Lord's facilities, such as mills, ovens, or winnow presses. A peasant could not grind grain at home without risking punishment. Instead, they paid to use the manor's mill. Bread baked in the Lord's oven carried a cost, as did wine pressed from grapes. These rules kept peasants dependent, ensuring that even the smallest necessities reinforced the authority of the manor. Every act of daily life carried the shadow of obligation, a reminder that nothing was entirely free. Despite these burdens, some peasants found ways to navigate the system with resilience. They bartered with neighbors, exchanged favors, and stretched resources to lessen the impact of duties. Families planned carefully, setting aside what little they could after obligations were met. These strategies did not break the system, but they offered a measure of control within it. Peasants became skilled at managing scarcity, turning even small opportunities into lifelines. In this way, endurance became not only physical but also practical, a quiet skill of survival honed over generations. The relationship between lord and peasant could vary depending on the character of the lord himself. Some were harsh, demanding excessive labor or punishing small infractions with severity. Others were more lenient, recognizing that the well-being of peasants ensured the well-being of the manor. A generous lord might offer relief during famine, while a greedy one could drive his people to despair. The balance of power was always uneven, yet it was also personal, shaped by the decisions of individuals. For peasants, their fate often rested on the temperament of the one who ruled above them. In times of war, duties grew heavier still. Peasants supplied food for soldiers, repaired fortifications, or carried messages across the countryside. They might be called to serve as laborers in building defenses, or even as untrained fighters when armies needed numbers. The burden of war fell hardest on those already struggling, for their fields lay untended while they fulfilled obligations. Hunger and destruction often followed, leaving families weaker than before. Yet, even in war, peasants had little choice but to serve, for loyalty to the manor was expected, regardless of cost. Religion also intersected with duties to the Lord. Peasants paid tithes to the church, often 1/10 of their harvest, on top of obligations to the manor. This meant their crops and goods were divided again and again before reaching their own families. To peasants, it sometimes felt as though every hand reached into their baskets, leaving little behind. Yet these duties were normalized, reinforced by tradition and fear of punishment. The peasant bore them with resignation, finding strength in patience and faith. Their endurance reflected a quiet acceptance of life's burdens as part of existence itself. Occasionally, peasants resisted the weight of their obligations. Small acts of defiance, working fields in secret, hiding grain, or using hand mills, despite bans, showed their desire for independence. Larger revolts sometimes erupted when villagers rose together against excessive demands. These uprisings were often crushed with force, yet they revealed the deep frustrations that lay beneath the surface of obedience. While most peasants endured quietly, history carries echoes of their resistance, moments when patience gave way to anger. Such acts remind us that even in submission, the desire for freedom never vanished completely. Still, for most peasants, duties became a rhythm of life, repeated across generations. A child grew watching parents deliver grain to the manor, and later carried baskets themselves. What seemed heavy became normal, accepted as the way the world worked. Over time, this acceptance dulled resistance, weaving duties into the fabric of daily life. Families spoke less of injustice and more of endurance, shaping their identity not around freedom but around survival within the system. In this way, obligation became tradition, carried forward like a burden and a legacy together. The manor system tied people to the land as tightly as roots tie a tree to soil. Peasants could not easily leave, for their duties followed them, and opportunities beyond the village were rare. Their world was small, defined by boundaries of obligation, yet within it they found continuity and purpose. They worked, they gave, and they endured, year after year, generation after generation. Though their names are forgotten, their labor built the foundations of medieval society. Without their duties, the lord's wealth and kingdom's stability could never have stood, and so, when we reflect on the duties of peasants to the lords of their land, we see both burden and resilience. The weight was heavy, the demands constant, yet through endurance, families survived. Their lives remind us of a world structured by inequality, yet also held together by the quiet strength of those who bore its weight. Tonight, as you close your eyes, perhaps you can picture the fields, the manor rising above, and the peasants carrying baskets of grain, symbols of duty, patience, and endurance. Let that steady image guide you toward rest, just as their steady footsteps once guided them through lives of labor and obligation. Even in lives filled with labor and hardship, peasants found moments of quietness, times when the weight of duty eased and the rhythm of work slowed. These moments were not grand or luxurious, but small pauses scattered through the day, the week, or the year. Rest came like a soft gift, treasured for its rarity, embraced for its calm. For peasants, quietness was not escape but balance, the other half of life that made endurance possible. Without these pauses, work would have been unbearable, but with them, strength was restored and patience renewed. One of the most common forms of rest was the evening, when tools were set aside and fields grew silent. Families walked slowly back to their cottages, shadows lengthening under the fading sun. The air cooled, smoke drifted from chimneys, and the sound of animals settling filled the village. Inside homes, the hearth glowed faintly, and meals simmered quietly in pots. These evenings did not bring entertainment or distraction, but they offered warmth, conversation, and closeness. Rest was not about idleness, but about returning to the heart of family life. The hearth itself became the center of rest. Flames flickered gently, casting soft shadows on walls and faces. Families gathered in its glow, listening to the crackle of wood and the murmurs of voices. Children drifted toward sleep, while elders shared stories, their voices slow and deliberate. The warmth reached into weary bones, softening the aches of the day. Though smoke lingered, though the room was crowded, this circle of fire became a place of peace. It was here that peasants remembered they were more than laborers. They were families bound by love and endurance. Sundays and days of rest offered another kind of quietness. Work in the fields paused, giving families time to gather, reflect, and breathe without urgency. These days did not erase hardship, but they offered relief, a rhythm of pause within the endless cycle of labor. Villagers saw neighbors, shared greetings, and strengthened the bonds of community. Children played more freely, their laughter echoing down dirt paths. Rest on these days was not a luxury, but a necessity, a reminder that life held more than toil. It restored spirit as much as body. Seasonal celebrations also carried moments of joy and reprieve. After harvest, when barns were full and fear of hunger lessened, villagers came together to share food, music, and laughter. These gatherings were brief, for soon winter loomed, but while they lasted, they offered memories of lightness. Dances, songs, and shared meals lifted hearts weary from months of labor. In these celebrations, rest took the form of joy, proving that even the hardest lives contained space for happiness. These moments became stories told through the year, treasures of memory that softened the darker days. For children, quiet moments were found in play. A hoop rolled down a path, a stick drawn through the dirt, or a simple game of chase carried freedom that adults rarely felt. Their laughter was music to tired parents, a reminder that innocence could bloom even in poverty. These games did not erase responsibility, for children worked as well, but they gave brief sparks of joy. Childhood was short, but in these small moments, it was bright. Rest for children was play, a pause from duty that filled their hearts with lightness. Nature itself provided rest for peasants who paused to notice it. A breeze through tall grass, the call of birds overhead, or the sight of stars in the night sky, all offered peace beyond labor. Though their lives were bound by necessity, the beauty of creation surrounded them constantly. To stand in a field at dusk, watching the sun dip below the horizon, was to feel a moment of stillness that words could not capture. These natural pauses did not demand time or cost. They were freely given, blessings scattered across daily life. For weary peasants, they were reminders that the world held calm as well as burden. Rest was not only physical, but also emotional. Families shared words of comfort, neighbors offered kindness, and laughter rose even in the midst of hardship. These acts of connection created spaces of rest within the heart, moments when fear or worry loosened its grip. A shared joke, a gentle story, or a song sung softly could lift spirits more than sleep alone. Rest was found not just in stillness, but in the bonds that tied people together. It was in these bonds that endurance grew strongest. Winter carried its own form of rest. Though it was harsh, fields lay empty, and though chores remained, the pace slowed compared to other seasons. Families spent more time indoors, repairing tools, telling stories, or simply huddling close against the cold. The world outside seemed frozen in silence, and within that stillness, peasants found time to breathe. Hunger and illness threatened, yet the long nights also carried a strange calm. Rest in winter was both necessity and inevitability, shaping the rhythm of life with its slower pace. Sleep itself was the purest form of rest. Straw beds, though uncomfortable by modern standards, cradled tired bodies enough to restore strength. Families lay close together, their breathing mingling in the dark. The sounds of the village quieted into night, broken only by the distant howl of animals or the soft sigh of wind. Sleep was not always deep, for hunger, cold, or illness often intruded, but it was vital, the single act that allowed labor to continue. In rest, peasants renewed themselves, ready to face the unending demands of dawn. There were also rests found in storytelling, an ancient tradition that wove together generations. In the evenings, elders spoke slowly, their voices carrying memories of past winters, old hardships, and lessons learned through patience. Children sat wide-eyed by the fire, listening not only for entertainment, but also for wisdom hidden within the tales. These stories gave comfort, linking the struggles of the present to those of the past, reminding listeners that hardship was nothing new. In hearing that their ancestors had endured, peasants found hope that they too could endure. The act of storytelling was as much a form of rest as sleep itself, calming minds while passing on knowledge. Singing also softened the edges of weary days. Voices rose in fields, in homes, or during festivals, carrying melodies that were simple yet powerful in their repetition. Songs eased the strain of long labor, synchronized movements during harvest, and filled cottages with warmth at night. Children learned these songs early, humming along before they knew all the words. Music was not performed for an audience, but shared among neighbors, binding them with rhythm and sound. In these moments, work and rest blurred together, for song transformed duty into something gentler, lifting hearts even as hands toiled. Rest could also be found in prayer and reflection, though peasants had little control over their circumstances. They understood that provision and survival came only by the will of Allah. A whispered prayer before meals, a moment of gratitude at the sight of harvest, or a quiet plea during times of illness gave them peace beyond the material. These moments were brief, woven naturally into the flow of life, yet they gave strength that no rest of body could equal. Faith carried peasants through, offering calm in uncertainty and reminding them that endurance was never theirs alone. The presence of neighbors turned even small pauses into moments of rest. A visit to share bread, a conversation at the well, or a helping hand in repairing a fence, all carried comfort. These interactions were simple, yet they reminded peasants that they were part of something larger than themselves. Loneliness was softened by shared presence, and burdens grew lighter when carried together. In this way, rest was not always solitude. Sometimes it was togetherness, a pause in work filled with human warmth. Such bonds made life less heavy, even if just for a moment. The cycles of work and rest shaped peasants' understanding of time itself. Days were measured not by clocks, but by labor, meals, and pauses. The year was not counted in dates, but in seasons, harvests, and winters survived. Rest came not as indulgence, but as rhythm, essential to the continuation of life. This rhythm created a sense of balance. Just as the land needed fallow fields to recover, so too did people need moments of stillness. In respecting this balance, peasants aligned their lives to the natural flow of creation. Even the animals contributed to the rhythm of rest. Chickens roosted, cows settled into stalls, and sheep huddled together for warmth. Their calmness spread through the village, reminding humans of the natural order of day and night. To hear the soft lowing of cattle or the gentle rustle of animals settling down was to feel that rest belonged not only to people but to all living things. The village, in its entirety, seemed to breathe out at dusk, exhaling the stress of the day into the cool night air. Rest was shared, uniting humans and animals under the same sky. Rest sometimes came disguised as waiting. Pauses between tasks, moments when weather halted work, or delays before the next season allowed peasants to slow down. Though these pauses were filled with uncertainty, they still provided a chance to breathe. Waiting for rain, for crops to ripen, or for illness to pass reminded peasants that not everything could be controlled. In surrendering to waiting, they found a kind of rest, a stillness forced by circumstances but softened by patience. These intervals, though uneasy, shaped their endurance as much as active labor did. The bond of rest extended into the village's quietest hours. After darkness fell, paths grew silent, shutters closed, and only the faint glow of hearths revealed life inside cottages. The air carried a stillness broken only by natural sounds, crickets, owls, or the whisper of wind. Villagers lay together in sleep, their struggles set aside for a few hours, their bodies resting under the same stars. The silence of night was not empty but full of calm, wrapping the community in a shared peace. These hours were sacred, even if unnoticed, for they renewed strength for another day. Though peasants lived hard lives, their ability to find rest gave them resilience. They did not require comfort to endure, only moments of pause, whether in family meals, songs, prayers, or simple stillness. Rest was not luxury, but necessity, a tool as essential as the plough or the scythe. It restored spirit, renewed patience, and softened hardship. Through rest, they found balance, allowing them to carry burdens without collapse. In this balance, life continued, generation after generation, steady and unbroken. And so, when we think of medieval peasants, we must not imagine only toil and struggle. We must also see the quiet moments, the glow of firelight on tired faces, the laughter of children playing at dusk, the soft murmur of neighbors sharing bread. These moments of rest did not erase hardship, but they gave meaning to endurance. They were the spaces where humanity breathed, where life felt more than survival. Tonight, as you listen and drift toward your own rest, may you carry with you the image of these quiet moments, reminders that even in the hardest lives, peace can be found. As we reach the end of this journey through the lives of medieval peasants, let us pause and reflect on what we have seen. We have walked their fields, entered their cottages, tasted their plain meals, and listened to their quiet moments of rest. Their lives, though humble, carried meaning in every detail. They remind us that survival is not always built on wealth or power, but on patience, endurance, and cooperation. In their story, we find not only the past, but also lessons that echo into the present. And as you listen, allow these reflections to settle into calmness, guiding you toward gentle rest. The peasants' world was small, yet complete. Their villages, though modest, carried everything they needed: family, community, land, and faith. They did not seek endless horizons, but found meaning in the steady rhythm of seasons, in the tasks repeated year after year. Their world teaches us that simplicity is not emptiness, but depth, reminder that even plain lives can carry quiet strength. To imagine them is to see life pared down to its essentials, free from distraction, centered on what mattered most. In their endurance, we glimpse the dignity of survival. Work shaped their days, but it did not erase their humanity. Behind every calloused hand was a parent, a child, a neighbor, a friend. The rhythm of toil was softened by the rhythm of laughter, prayer, and song. Their lives were not only labor, but also love. Love for family, for community, and for the land that sustained them. Though history often forgets their names, it cannot erase their contribution. for their unseen hands built the foundation upon which kingdoms rose. Without peasants, there would have been no castles, no cities, no history as we know it. The cottages where they lived may seem fragile to us, with smoky hearths and straw beds. Yet within those walls, strength was forged, resilience nurtured, and families bound together. Their homes were not monuments of stone but shelters of memory, carrying the essence of daily life. Inside them, meals were shared, stories were told, and children grew into the adults who would take their place in the cycle. Each home, no matter how small, was a world of its own, filled with endurance and meaning. To step into those spaces in our imagination is to honor their quiet dignity. The food they ate was plain, yet it carried them through hardship. Bread, pottage, vegetables, dairy, and the occasional gift of meat or fish sustained life, not through flavor but through necessity. These meals, though modest, were symbols of patience. Every bite carried the labor of planting, tending, and harvesting, and every shared meal reinforced the bonds of family and community. Food was never wasted, for its value was understood deeply. In their diet, we see not scarcity alone, but also gratitude for what little they had. Their meals were survival, and survival itself was a quiet victory. Their duties to the lords remind us of the inequalities of their time. They bore heavy burdens, giving labor and goods to support the wealth of others. Yet they endured, balancing hardship with resilience, accepting what they could not change while still finding ways to live meaningfully. The system was unjust, but their endurance within it was remarkable. In their patience, we see not defeat, but quiet strength, the ability to carry on even when freedom was limited. Their story whispers of endurance that outlasts injustice. The rhythm of seasons shaped not only their work, but also their spirit. Spring brought hope, summer demanded effort, autumn gave relief, and winter enforced patience. This cycle repeated endlessly, marking their lives more surely than any calendar. In this rhythm, they found balance, aligning their days with the steady heartbeat of the earth. Their acceptance of time as it was given, rather than as they wished it to be, teaches us humility. To move with the seasons rather than against them was the secret of their endurance. Family gave peasants their strength. Parents guided children, children supported parents, and elders shared wisdom. Together, they formed a circle of survival that no one could endure alone. These bonds turned hardship into endurance, transforming the weight of life into something bearable. In family, they found love, and in community, they found protection. Their wealth was not in coins, but in relationships, and their survival was proof of the strength of human bonds. This lesson remains timeless, for it reminds us that true strength is found not in solitude but in togetherness. Quiet moments completed their lives, softening the edges of endless labor. Firelight in the evening, laughter of children, songs shared during work, and prayers whispered in silence gave depth to their existence. These pauses were not luxuries, but necessities, without which endurance would have faltered. In rest, they found renewal, and in renewal, they found the ability to face another day. These moments remind us that even the hardest lives carry spaces of peace, and that balance between work and rest is as vital now as it was then. Their rest was their resilience, and so, when we reflect on peasants, we see lives that were plain yet profound, heavy with labor yet rich in meaning. Their story is not one of glory but of endurance, not of conquest but of survival. They lived humbly, but they lived with purpose, their hands shaping history silently. Their voices may be lost, but their legacy remains, carried in the memory of fields tilled, cottages built, and families raised. To remember them is to honor the countless unnamed who carried the weight of history on their shoulders. They were the quiet builders of the past. The peasant's endurance reminds us that history is not only written by kings or nobles, but also by the countless unnamed who lived with patience. Their hands built the fields that fed armies, their labor supported the halls of lords, and their quiet strength held society together. They were rarely celebrated, but they were indispensable. In reflecting on their lives, we are reminded that greatness is not always loud or visible. Sometimes it is the quiet persistence of ordinary people that sustains the world. Their legacy is hidden, but it is no less important. When we imagine their nights, we see cottages glowing faintly, families gathered close, and villagers resting together under the stars. These scenes remind us that human lives, no matter how distant in time, are connected by the same needs for warmth, food, and love. Though centuries separate us, the essence of family, community, and endurance remains unchanged. Their story bridges the past to the present, showing us that beneath the surface of history, human hearts have always sought the same comforts. The peasants' lives may have been simple, but in their simplicity, they mirror our own. Their hardships also highlight the value of gratitude. A loaf of bread, a warm fire, a moment of laughter, these were treasures to peasants, worth more than gold. In seeing their appreciation for small blessings, we are reminded to find joy in what we often overlook. Gratitude turns scarcity into enough, and enough into peace. The peasant's perspective offers us a lesson that even when life is heavy, the smallest gifts can carry great meaning. Their gratitude teaches us humility. The peasant's acceptance of duty reflects a deeper truth about human resilience. They carried burdens, not because they chose them, but because life demanded it. Yet within that endurance, they found ways to live with dignity, to love their families, and to nurture communities. Their story reminds us that resilience is not only about strength, but also about patience, about carrying on quietly even when the weight feels endless. In this quiet strength lies a form of greatness, often unseen. Their patience was their triumph. Looking back, we see that the peasants' lives were not wasted, even if they were unrecorded. Every field tilled, every meal shared, every child raised contributed to the continuity of history. Without them, kingdoms could not have stood, and the grand stories of rulers would have crumbled. Their lives mattered deeply, though their names were forgotten. In remembering them, we honor the truth that history is not only crowns and battles, but also the steady endurance of ordinary lives. Their memory is carried in the soil, in the seasons, and in the quiet echo of the past. Their story also teaches balance. Just as they balanced work with rest, scarcity with gratitude, and duty with love, so too must we find balance in our own lives. The peasant's rhythm may have been shaped by fields and seasons, but the principle remains timeless. Balance sustains endurance, allowing life to continue with steadiness. Their example reminds us to pause, to rest, to be grateful, and to carry on with patience. Balance was their survival, and it can be our lesson as well. As we close this reflection, picture again the medieval village. Small cottages clustered together, smoke rising from chimneys, fields stretching outward into the horizon. Imagine the footsteps of peasants returning home at dusk, weary but steady, their lives quiet yet meaningful. Their world was not ours, yet in imagining it, we find a calm rhythm that soothes our own. The image carries us into rest, just as their days carried them into the quiet of night. Let this vision guide you gently toward sleep. The peasant story is not meant to stir excitement, but to settle the mind. Their steady endurance, their quiet bonds, and their simple lives remind us of the calm that can be found in repetition. Listening to their story is like walking slowly through fields at dusk. The air cool, the world hushed, and the heart softened. There is no need for urgency here, only for rest. Their story becomes not only history, but a lullaby, guiding you gently into dreams. As you lie here now, let the lessons of their lives wash over you like a calm stream. Feel the steadiness of their rhythm, the patience of their endurance, and the warmth of their quiet bonds. Let go of the weight of your own day, just as they once laid down their tools at dusk. Rest is yours to embrace, as it was theirs. May the calm of their story carry you softly into peace. And so, our journey with the medieval peasants comes to an end. We leave behind their fields, their cottages, their meals, and their quiet nights, but we carry with us their strength. Their story, though plain, whispers of resilience, patience, and gratitude. Let those whispers guide you now, as your eyes grow heavy and your breathing slows. Close your day with calm and drift gently into rest, knowing that in remembering their quiet lives, we find peace for our own.